Good morning, Premier Windy, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the Bosbarat. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person, but I guess in our modern age, we have these alternative technological opportunities. So I really appreciate that you've mobilized your office to enable this. So I've been asked to make a fairly focused and I guess provocative contribution to stimulate your discussion this morning, where you're looking at the connections between mobility, transport, and spatial transformation. I've got a lot to say on the topic, as I'm sure you're aware, but I'm going to try and keep this really brief. So by definition, I'll be a little bit crude, and I'll maybe overstate a few things, but it is important to get some of the core messages across. And I'm really sorry that I can't be there for the discussion and the debate, but I'm, of course, at your disposal at any future occasion where you wish to discuss or explore these issues further. So this topic is, of course, immensely complicated and entangled, and it is very difficult to come up with one or two big ideas that is going to lead to structural transformation in terms of the spatial dynamics of our cities and towns across the province. But that said, we also know that as a country and as a province, we've been thinking about these matters for a long time. And as you can see in the slide, in 2004, Breaking New Ground came out, where a clear policy agenda was set on how to ensure we begin to reverse the legacies of apartheid. This was followed up in 2012 by the National Development Plan, and specifically Chapter 8. And this in turn, of course, informed the work on the Integrated Urban Development Framework that the National Cabinet adopted in 2016. And as you know, lastly, but I guess in some ways most pertinently for today, the Living Cape policy framework was, of course, adopted by the predecessor cabinet in January of this year. And across all of these policies, as the state, you are wrestling with these questions. And you've got many ideas, many approaches, but we also know that it is very difficult to see the long-term trends changing anytime soon. The reasons for that, again, are too many and complex for me to get into in a short presentation, but I just want to mention that as background, so to remind all of us, of course, that we have been having this discussion for a long time. Now, what I want to focus on specifically today is maybe the hardest part of this issue, and that is the connection between what I call stunted social mobility and spatial inequality. This, for me, lives at the core of it, and to make things practical, I will draw on work that I've been doing the last 2 years in something called the Integration Syndicate, where we looked specifically at inequality, spatial inequality, and divides within the context of Cape Town. Now, I know that the contexts are different across the province, but I guess Cape Town has got these challenges in its most acute form, so it might be relevant and useful to use it as a reference point. Again, I don't have time to go into the deep history and roots of this question, and of course, the slide shows you that spatial inequality and divides were baked into the DNA of urban settlements in South Africa during the colonial period. And of course, we cannot expect that we can reverse that within 20 years or 25 years. We've got to understand those long histories. Now, to come back to this point about stunted social mobility and spatial inequality, and let me put up front what the diagnostic frame is that we developed through this integration syndicate process over the last 2 years. As you will see in this diagram, that there are 3 drivers of this phenomena called stunted social mobility. The first is what we all know is deep and pervasive economic exclusion. This manifests, of course, in large-scale unemployment and especially amongst Black youth. Secondly, it's something that is harder to define, is a bit more difficult to put one's finger on, but I call it in shorthand cultural erasure. And what I mean by this is our inability as different cultures, different communities in the context of Cape Town and our various towns across the province to deal with our issues, if you will, to deal with the fact that racism and especially institutional racism remains pervasive, to deal with the fact that inequality is racially and gender based in many instances. But when it comes to our day-to-day interactions, when it comes to figuring out how as a society within the private sector or in social contexts or religious institutions or the state or whatever the case might be, how we speak about these things in ways that really gets to the core of it and helps us to use our legacy issues to transform society and ourselves at an individual level, we don't really have the tools. We don't have the language. Whether it's decoloniality or whether it is Rainbow Nation, everything seems to fall short, and everything seems to not quite get at what we feel inside and what we know are the brutal friction points in our society that, if you will, kind of undermines the functioning of our institutions, but most importantly, I believe, undermines the incredible investments that the public sector makes in development, in community upliftment, in education, in healthcare, and so forth and so forth. Now we have to find ways to talk about it. And relegating it to something that the Department of Arts and Culture deals with is simply not good enough. But again, I don't have time to go into the detail of it. I just want to flag this as something that really animated us and that I believe is something we've got to come to terms with if we want to understand and transcend this connection between stunted social mobility and spatial inequality. The third factor, of course, is somewhat controversial in this context because it is what I call poor social development outcomes. Now, social development drivers, as we know from Amartya Sen's work, is really education, health, and social safety nets. Now, the provincial government, of course, is responsible for education and health, and relative to the other provinces, of course, does really well. But, again, when we look at the most important demographic, Black youth who are unemployed or not in education, then we know that we are not seeing the outcomes that will transform within a generation our most disadvantaged communities. So we've got to accept, even though we're trying our best, that the outcomes we're seeing at the moment are simply not good enough. Now, the issue is that these three things in combination, structural economic exclusion, poor social development outcomes, cultural erasure, feeds into a generational problem of a lack of social mobility. Now, what makes it unique in our case and how it ties in with spatial inequality is that due to our history, we see a connection between those social phenomena and what one can call spatial concentrations of disadvantage and inequality. And for me, this produces at a deep, profound level a crisis of meaning and identity. Young people do not know who they are because they do not know if they have a future. In fact, they're pretty convinced they don't have one. So how does one believe in oneself? How does one believe in one's community and one's family networks if there's such a fundamental sense of a truncated future, right? So again, complicated issues, a lot more to say about it, but I'll move swiftly along because I wanted to underscore that this analysis informs what will follow. And I've been asked to be propositional, to talk about what could be done. So let me then shift register and introduce the Integration Syndicate. So this was an intense curated conversation over a year between 25 leaders across Cape Town. I invited 5 leaders from different sectors, private sector, big and small, public sector, provincial and local government, also some national departments, and then the academy, NGOs, and social movements. And the idea was that we would leave our institutional identities at the door so that we could spend 3 to 5 hours once a month to really wrestle with both the historical, the contemporary, and the potentially future manifestations of spatial inequality in Cape Town. There's a book that is going to come out, and I will give each member of cabinet and each HOD a copy when it appears next month, where we've documented this whole process and we've set out the provocations that I'm going to talk about. But at the heart of this was we wanted to see whether it was possible to come up with a novel analysis about how to respond to spatial inequality in Cape Town. We translated that into 5 provocations, and I want to speak to 4 of those as the ideas that I hope you can reflect on in your deliberations this morning. The 5 provocations are what we call e-taxis, and I'll say more about that in a second. Living differently, which is a very explicit and a deliberate ripping off of the Living Cape policy framework that the Western Cape government adopted in January this year. Thirdly, what we call cultural narratives. Fourthly, placemaking through public works. And lastly, what we call the solidarity switchboard. Now, at the heart of it is we've translated that analysis about stunted social mobility to really say, if we as a society have to agree on our fundamental challenges, what are those? Can we name them? And these are the four. Economic duality, which I've spoken about, this problem of stunted social mobility that disproportionately affects black youth, systematic environmental risk, and by this I mean that our growth model as a country, and of course by extension as a province, is fundamentally resource intensive and carbon intensive, and therefore with a limited shelf life. Within the next decade, we have to transition, as we know, through the work of Green Cape and others, to a low carbon trajectory. And then finally, this issue of cultural onhandigheid, that we don't know how to deal with our stuff, and which I think is why creativity and innovation is lacking in our society. Again, shorthand, I'm just mentioning these, not discussing them. Moving on to the provocations then. For the provocations to make sense, we've got to remind ourselves of some of the fundamental spatial inequalities. This is a familiar slide to everyone. The jobs are not where the poor live somewhere else, and the red spikes here show you particularly the informal settlements. This is an interesting slide. This is data that shows where all investment went, private sector investment, between 2005 and 2015 in Cape Town, in the metropolitan area. And what you see with the size of the bubbles is different categories of investment, but most importantly, it seems like, on the face of it, that from the private sector perspective, there's an investment strike. We are not doing the townships. We are not putting private capital where the majority of Cape Townians live and where the greatest need for employment is. Then if we track the investments of the private market in the real estate sector, you can see this classic picture of urban sprawl and as far away as possible from where the poor live, and in fact this is being exacerbated. But the public investment portfolio is the exact opposite of that. We are crowding in investment in where the majority black population lives, but of course because it doesn't catalyze private investment, you don't have the cumulative impacts that's required to achieve social transformation. Again, familiar story, you know this, but good to remind us. Now, to respond to this, the City of Cape Town, in its last iterations of its IDP and in its spatial development framework, decided that the key lever that's going to transform this is transit-oriented development, and the mechanism to achieve that is, of course, the BRT investment. Now, this is sound up to a point. The problem is, when you look at this model very closely, what you recognize is that it's essentially a real estate model for spatial integration. What they are assuming is that as you improve public transport, as these transport nodes emerge, you will be able to get a new form of real estate emerging around these nodes and along these strategic corridors. The problem with this is that if we look at real estate cycles, this is essentially a market-driven approach that is going to take anything between 30 to 60 years to show us a little bit of result. We just don't have enough churn in our real estate market for this to be the primary mechanism to try and deal with spatial inequality. It is an important part of the story, but as a solution, it is wholly inadequate to deal with the legacies that we see in Cape Town and in all the major cities of the Western Cape. Now, very briefly then, the 4 propositions out of the 5. Firstly, e-taxi. This deals with the mobility question. Complicated from the perspective of the provincial government because of all of the regulatory questions that is involved when it comes to the minibus taxi. And people in this room know better than anyone else just how complex and intractable those issues are. So this is not the time to get into those debates. This is about a vision, about how to think about the long term. So our provocation is that we've got to embrace minibus taxis as a homebrew public transport solution that is actually suited for a low-density, sprawled urban environment. If we can then imagine that these, what we call e-taxis, if they are recapitalized to become not just the vehicles that we know of today, but enabled by digital technologies so that they incorporate GPS, they enable e-hailing, they can also have various security and safety measures built into these vehicles into the future, we can deal with the problems of a cash economy, of safety issues, of the wrong incentives driving the wrong behavior. But the real driver of this provocation is this slide, which shows the capital projected expenditure of the City of Cape Town between now and 2032. And what you will notice from this slide is this is numbers supplied by the City of Cape Town, that the capex investment for the BRT trunk routes is tenfold more than anything else in the city over the next decade. That includes solid waste, it includes sanitation, it includes stormwater, electricity, and so forth. Now, this is clearly not a particularly wise way to spend money on a service that we know only covers about 2% of the ridership on a good day at the moment, and even best case scenario is not able to recover its costs. So can we rethink that capex? Keep in mind that we have to hold on to these trunk route ideas so that public transport has right of way and has privileged mobility, but not dedicate them to this expensive technology, which is the buses and the reinforced lanes. Instead, what we are proposing is that we keep the lanes, we make them available to all forms of public transport, and that we look towards integrated ticketing and digital payments, and that most importantly, we figure out with other provinces and metropolitan governments how to persuade national government to rethink the subsidy regime. And that, of course, is a precondition for the solution to work. The second provocation then is where we build off and reinforce the Living Cape document and framework of the Western Cape government. And here the provocation is, for public housing, can we put a moratorium on sprawl for the next decade? How do we do that? If you take any typical public land that's related to schools or the surfeit of green spaces and parks across all of our cities and towns in the Western Cape, and you think how we can reutilize these areas. Now, this illustration shows you a typical school in a typical Cape Flat scenario, or even in a suburb for that matter. And as you can see, the school is fenced. You pay for the maintenance of those fences, and it's an awful recurring cost. But the school is essentially cut off from the community. Also, there's no money to maintain the sports grounds and what happens at the school. If we then go to the provocation, we say take down the fences, think of 2 to 3, 4-story walk-ups that becomes the perimeter of the school, creates an interface between the school and the community, and essentially you activate those edges so that you can have small businesses thrive there, you can have early childhood development, and you can have a variety of mechanisms. Again, a lot of devil is in the detail here, but just as a way of thinking about it. We then gave this treatment, and I'll skip the next slide, and we sort of mapped across the city where all the school grounds are, where all the public parks are, to show what is the quantum that we're talking about. So let's look at this slide. You will see a typical scenario. You've got a secondary school and a primary school within 500 meters of each other, and in between are just these derelict spaces that is just awful and uninspiring. And so what we did was we identified all of that land and showed what the potential is if you apply this program. And this illustrates a combination of infill housing, 2 to 3-story walk-ups, urban agriculture, green walkways to the lake spaces adjoining the school, and on the top of that diagram, a marketplace where people can then sell the produce from the urban agriculture. And of course, you can imagine the learners can interact with these spaces, and that can form part of the curriculum and so forth. This is eminently doable. This is something where almost all of the capabilities and resources sit within the provincial government to achieve. Let's look at another example. And I like this one because this is where I live in Pinelands. In front of my house, there's a big open green field. Adjacent to my house, another 6 or 7 of those. And this is all between a major commercial node, Howard Center, and a rail station. And so what we did was, again, to isolate all of these parcels of land and show how it becomes possible to do infill development in strategically located areas, but also provide opportunities for the workers at Pick and Pay at Howard Center, for the security guards who work there, to live within walking distance of their places of work. This can be done in any suburb, in any town or city in the Western Cape province. Of course, it will require political leadership to deal with the NIMBYism issues here, but in theory, it is completely achievable. The third provocation I want to talk about, listed as 4 on the slide, but of course I've skipped the third one, is placemaking through public works. And at the heart of this provocation is the idea that if we take the tens of thousands of people who are enrolled in extended public works and the community works program, and we organize that more systematically to focus on improving the public and the living environment in the township context, in other words, placemaking, we can fundamentally transform the quality of life on a daily basis, but also the economic opportunity structure. So what we are interested in is how these workers, if organized differently in relation to placemaking, can drive a focus on safety, very, very important, at the heart of securing opportunity in the townships, cultural production, green infrastructure, and of course, informal trade. One example I want to focus on very briefly is using them to transform the informal early childhood development centers that of course is pervasive. This slide is too small for you to read, but the idea is just to show you how this framework can be elaborated in relation to food security, in relation to cultural practices, safety and mobility, livelihoods, sport and recreation, and educational spaces. This slide shows you the detail of an informal shack where maybe 80 to 90 kids are housed on a daily basis and they're just fed and cleaned, but no pedagogic process happening. And on the right-hand side, we elaborated how you could incrementally upgrade that shack using renewable technologies, using renewable materials, and public works workers to do the construction and, most importantly, the maintenance once the renovation has happened. This can easily be replicated across the various informal ECDs across the province. And just imagine what that kind of investment that's about placemaking, safety, looking after kids, will do for the school readiness of those children once they enter grade R or basic education. Lastly then, it's about making the connections to the fourth industrial revolution, about understanding that digital literacy is a fundamental requirement for the transition of young people. So here we were inspired by the work of an institution in Elsies River called ICANN Centre, which is supported by the provincial government and the City of Cape Town, but also the work of R Labs across the Cape Flats. And these are two institutions that have experimented with digital hubs that is not just about computer training, but is about a myriad of things to open up the imagination of young people about how digital technologies doesn't only allow social media and social connection, but also gaming, a way of reading space differently, also access to the production of music, the production of film, but most importantly, access to networks that are trying to do things entrepreneurially. Again, we envisage that one can really focus on replicating this model as a mechanism to both enhance the resources of social movements and social organizations in the township context, but most importantly, channeling young people into a set of practical skills that allows them to transition into the fourth industrial revolution. This slide just shows how one can then imagine how that can replicate itself over time and create the possibility for social solidarity across the whole city. Again, there's a lot more detail in the nuance of this provocation, but I will have to leave it at that. So, members of Cabinet, Premier Windy, allow me to conclude with 4 very brief points. 1, as we know, urban divisions are hardwired into the built and cultural fabric of all of South Africa's cities and towns. And every rand the public sector spends and every rand the private sector spends tends to reinforce that long-term trajectory. That's a problem. We have to get a different return by spending differently and working differently. Secondly, we cannot afford to leave the solution to the question of spatial inequality in the realm of TOD innovations and technology. That's a precondition, but it is not a sufficient condition to achieve the kind of cultural transformation we're talking about. Thirdly, if we don't foster, in cultural terms, a shared narrative as a society, it's going to be very hard to sustain the new kind of investments that we need and the new kinds of programs that we have to instill. And finally, we have to understand that security for the urban poor requires that we create more employment opportunities. The mechanism we have as the state is EPWP and community works programs. But let's use that tool and really begin to transform the living environment, the economic environment where most of the excluded people live. And if we can understand how these four things come together, we can begin to see how it is possible to connect and to break the connection between stunted social mobility and spatial transformation. I'm sorry if I went a little bit too long, but I'm really appreciative of this opportunity. And again, I'm at your disposal to discuss any of these ideas in greater detail. And thank you for your time and attention.